So we're back with another Delve Into Deepholm card review. Today we got Mage, Hunter, Paladin, and Death Knight cards. Kicking it off here with, I think, a really fun design. This is Elemental Companion, much like our animal companion friends of old. This is a 3-mana spell that's going to summon you a random companion. Clearly, these are a reference to Misha, Huffer, and Leok, because these are Misho, Hefar, and Luek. Very subtle changes here to the names. But as you can see, this is a dual class card for Mage and Hunter. And man, these are a couple pretty powerful companions, I would say. And then you've got Misho, who is just a 4/4 that can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, which I mean, I guess is pretty decent on board on turn 3. Like, maybe kind of hard to answer, kind of an aggressive body. It still falls over to rush minions though, which are so common. It falls over to weapons, which is still pretty common. So not the craziest, but I think Hefar and Luek in particular, I mean, pretty nuts. Hefar, your spells cost 1 less. That clearly has some pop-off potential. The Sorcerer's Apprentice of old. Now, importantly, you know, this is not going to be a reliable result, so you can't have like a deck that's built around getting this 1 cost discount and creating all these like chains and scary combos and stuff, because it won't, you know, happens 1 out of 3 times, or as the memes might suggest, maybe it's always Hefar. He's just always in Hefar. Hefar, who knows? It's made up. But, you know, anyway, it's not going to be a combo enabler, but there will still be moments where you play this on turn 3 and it helps you cheat out you know, a 1 cost spell or something. Just weave it in. There will be moments you play this on turn 5 and helps you cheat out something, you know. So getting a couple extra spell casts because you randomly hit Hefar is a bonus that will absolutely happen. So it doesn't have to be some big awesome combo, something you designed around. There's just gonna be moments where saving a few mana points here or there is really gonna stack up to some big swings. And you have Luek, of course, pretty similar here with spell damage +2. Again, not a reliable result, but still occasionally will pay off. Probably the one you're least excited to get if you like tempo this on turn 3, because that spell damage is unlikely to be relevant. Luek might die. But as you play this later in the game, weave this in on turn 6 or 7 or something, and you have a couple spare mana and cards to play afterwards, that spell damage obviously could pay off in some big ways. And with Mage, you know, of course, we know they got a lot of cheap spells and like spell damage. That's always been true. But actually with Hunter, and in particular Arcane Hunter right now, I think both Hefar and Luek actually make a ton of sense. Arcane Hunter wants that spell damage to send crazy things face. They have multiple ways to benefit from spell damage directly with their spells on top of the damage itself. So, you know, stuff, summoning the extra lynxes and stuff, drawing extra cards off Conjured Arrow and so on. But then with Hefar too, like there's a bunch of super cheap spells in Hunter. The like arcane shots of the world, the ricochet shots, but also like bananas, for instance. Play Hefar, play a bunch of bananas basically for free, buff up that Hefar, it survives, you play it in a future turn. So as reasonable as this looks for Mage, because that's stuff Mage always likes to do, I think it actually makes a ton of sense for various Hunter builds, whether that's Arcane, the sort of spell spam Hunters with barrels of monkeys and bananas. I could see this working in both those worlds and both of these classes. So yeah, I think Elemental Companion here, both a really cool, fun design, but also probably a pretty good card too. So moving on here, we've got the Mantle Shaper, and this has the potential to be a scary card. I don't know if it's gonna be, but it has that potential. It's a 5-mana 5/5 Elemental Naga, and it costs 1 less for each spell you've cast while holding this. So obviously the potential there is that this could relatively quickly become a 0-mana 5/5 that you weave into turns. Any spell heavy deck is going to do that. We've just talked about a bunch of 1 cost spells in Hunter, bananas, arcane stuff, etc. Mage obviously can weave together a bunch of cheap spells as well. And it's not like this has to be 0 mana to be good. A 2-mana 5/5 that you weave into a turn alongside a spell or something is actually still really nice. That could be a big board development, particularly in more aggressively minded decks. Could be a great follow-up to some of those spells. So it has that potential. Now, the challenges for this card, right, are that it does have to be in hand. So You know, top decking this is going to feel really bad sometimes. If you're like in the mid game, you top deck this, you may not have a bunch of cheap spells left. Might just take too long. You don't want to play a 5-mana 5/5. You're really sad about that result. So, you know, some downsides there. Also, the risk of kind of keeping it in hand early means you're actually a little bit less likely to hit the stuff you need early to activate it. So, you know, like you might want to 1-drop and a bunch of bananas. If you got a Mantle Shaper in hand, it might be harder to pull all that together just because you're sitting on a Mantle Shaper or multiple Mantle Shapers. So the opportunity cost of this existing and needing to be there in hand for it to feel swingy is notable. I think that's easily overcome though, because I think it's just swingy enough that there will be moments that lines up. You kind of see the mulligan come together. It's like, oh, okay, I've got what I need to make this Mantle Shaper come down. This is gonna be like a great like turn 3 or turn 4 play. I'm gonna save that and overwhelm the opponent. So the other angle for this card, which I didn't talk about, is that it's potentially really nice in like a Spitelash Siren deck, which is something we haven't seen lately with various nerfs and changes to that. We see a lot more Rainbow Mage than Spitelash Siren, but this is sort of perfect for a deck that's looking to weave together cheap spells and cheap Naga plays, which is exactly what this does, obviously. Can be a 0-mana Naga to activate that mana gain on your Spitelash while still playing a bunch of spells, etc. So maybe an angle there too for this, although I don't know. I don't see this like reviving that deck necessarily or anything. Just an absolute possibility. This is also an elemental for Elemental Mage, but again, I don't know. That's going to be more minion based, so this probably doesn't get cheaper. But I think there are still plenty of spell angles for this. I just, you know, I don't see it living in that corridor creeper space. Like it's got that potential, which is frightening. It's scary. If you got like 0-mana spells out there, you could do the dude with the snake oil, etc., and like try to farm into a Mantle Shaper. That's all spooky. I don't know that it's like gonna be excellent though. Probably spookier in thought and in theory than in reality. So a card with potential that might be hard to realize. So moving on to Mage only card here, we've got Summoning Ward. This is a new secret. When your turn starts, summon a copy of your highest cost minion. And boy, that's a tough one, because normally when your turn starts, you don't really have a lot of minions left. Usually, you know, your opponent's clearing your board a large majority of the time. And if they don't, they want to clear the highest, biggest thing anyway, typically. You know, if you have an 8/8 and a 2/2 on board, your opponent's going to do all the work they can to kill the 8/8, right? That's going to be their priority. So very often, Summoning Ward's going to summon something that's just kind of left over that, you know, the opponent didn't feel like was a huge priority, especially if they know this secret exists. So the challenges of having anything at all are there, but also just this very naturally kind of plays into what your opponent wants to do. I also got confirmation that this does not work with dormant minions. It's not like you can park a dormant minion out there and it'll summon a big, awesome dormant thing that's going to get resummoned. So to me, this card just looks really clunky, really awkward. I don't see a lot of use cases for this one. You know, if you could stick a big, awesome thing that makes this really rewarding, probably way ahead anyway, and this just felt like a waste. Maybe just could have done something better. Played a better secret, or just played a card for 3 that felt more relevant than the Summoning Ward. So this looks like a really weak secret, and Mage secrets already sometimes have a lot of problems just being played honestly. So I don't see much future for this. Moving on here to Hunter, talking about some of those cheap spells in Hunter to enable some of this stuff. We've got another cheap arcane spell here for Hunter. For the Arcane Hunter package. Now, Arcane Hunter is still pretty good. It's a tier 2 deck over the last week at Diamond and Legend. It's not as good as Highlander Hunter, which is actually the best version of Hunter right now. Kind of big Highlander stuff, but it's still quite competitive, and cards like this could go a long way. This is card damage that can go face, and it also summons you a minion, which scales really nicely with spell damage. We saw our Leok spell damage card earlier, right? If this deals 3 and summons you a 3-drop for 1 mana, you're super pumped, right? That's great. You can play this for free alongside your Hefar, which is great. I think this just fits the Arcane Hunter game plan perfectly. Just like spell damage scaling, amazing for all the spell damage buffs. Face damage potential is great, and also can play it on turn 1 and develop a little bit of tempo as well for a deck that does like to be aggressive and get out a little bit early. So all in all, I mean, just a perfectly designed card for a good deck, and that means this is probably going to be a great card. Moving on here to the Obsidian Revenant. This is Hunter and Death Knight dual class, 6 mana, 4/6 elemental. It's got taunt and death rattle. Summon 2 random death rattle minions that cost 3 or less. So this is death rattles on death rattles on death rattles. But I don't think this is a very good minion, despite how sick this artwork is. He looks so freaking cool with those big, awesome purple swords. Like, that is a baller elemental, but I don't think this card's going to prove very useful. Basically, although this is a big pile of stuff, like the uber piloted shredder of sorts, and, you know, all these death rattle chains could be pretty cool. It's pricey. It's 6 mana. You need your 6 mana cards to start doing pretty big things, not just being piles of stats. And death rattle minions that cost 3 or less is really inconsistent. If they cost 3 specifically, you know, you could rely on these being fairly, you know, useful things, bigger things that could have some meaningful stats. But a lot of times you're going to hit like 1s and 2s that just don't feel that useful. Random little synergy things that just don't line up for you. So I think the inconsistency problems here just aren't going to make up for this one. It doesn't exactly have a huge output anyway. It doesn't have a very directed game plan. Yes, of course, death rattle synergies exist, but you still kind of want those to have reliable and big and impactful results, being either like face damage, big minions, cheating stuff out in some way. This kind of feels like it's going the other direction. Playing a medium-sized card that's summoning you really small stuff. That just doesn't feel like a game plan that makes much sense to me. So perhaps a card I think here that feels pretty weak, which is sad for such sick freaking artwork. All right, so next up here we have Mismatched Fossils, a 3-mana spell, Hunter and Death Knight. This one allows you to discover a beast and an undead and then swap their stats. So I think the goal here at a straightforward level is to like discover a super cheap card, and then next up get a really big expensive card, and then you have, you know, a Snow Flipper Penguin and a Thaddeus, and suddenly you have a 0 mana 11/11 because the Snow Flipper Penguin is going to swap stats with the Thaddeus, and boom, you got a 0 mana 11/11, or, you know, maybe a 1 or 2 mana 11/11, or occasionally it's not going to quite be an 11/11, but, you know, basically trying to cheat some big stats into a small cost card. Now, obviously, you're left over with a Thaddeus that's a 1/1 at that stage, which maybe is not too exciting. Big old 10 cost 1/1 Thaddeus, but hopefully the swing off the first one is useful enough. Now, you know, perusing the sort of undead and beast pools in standard right now, clearly that's a super high roll example. Very often, you know, you're going to find results kind of in the middle of the band. You're going to get like a 2 or a 3 cost and like a 6 cost at the peak, you know, and sometimes you might just get like a 2 and a 3, and it's all 2s and 3s and there's no interesting swaps. There are also like some kind of sneaky plays as well. You can do stuff like Vicious Bloodworm if you're a Death Knight, you know, pick this as your beast, and then, you know, again, take a Thaddeus or whatever, right? And then the Vicious Bloodworm is going to give a minion in your hand 11 attack when you play it, because, you know, the stats basically have a bonus effect here beyond just being stats. So there are like some crazy high rolls like that exist, but that's going to be super inconsistent. I think very often the results on this are going to feel bad. And first and foremost, you have this 3-mana tax over the top of all this, right? You have to pay 3 mana to do this. So although you get, you know, a 0 mana 11/11, it's really kind of like you spent 3 to do that. And how often is that going to hit? Very rarely. So I think the results here are going to be far too inconsistent, way too unpredictable. Some high roll moments when this is like discovered or generated randomly, it'll be super fun, but I don't see how people make an excuse to put this in their deck. I just don't think it'll do often enough to be worth it. So moving on here, we've got our Death Knight only card, the Quartzite Crusher, a new weapon, 4 mana 3/3, Blood and Frost runes. It's got lifesteal and freeze any character damaged by your hero, which I actually really like this weapon's effect and everything and cost. It's really just the runes here that make you nervous for the Quartzite Crusher. When we look at good Death Knight decks right now, we got Plague DK and a Highlander Triple Blood DK, both in tier 2. Rainbow DK is kind of floating just outside tier 2, which would be able to run this, but, you know, it's always a restriction basically to have split runes like this. That always limits the potential use cases for this card. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? Is the rune restriction here going to be a big issue? But as for the card itself, I actually think this is really good. Being able to freeze the opponent's face in particular just gives you a really nice advantage. Like, this heals 9, which is good. This can clean up minions while protecting your health total, which is great. But if you needed to, being able to hit face to lock them out of face attacks feels really nice. Of course, stuff like Odin is out there. It's like, oh god, I'm going to die to Odin. Well, I need to freeze the enemy face. But even things like Ignis weapons are out there too, right? Just being able to freeze out an Ignis weapon for multiple turns in a row could be a really big deal with something like this weapon. So I think this effect is actually very powerful. The stat line actually works for me as a 4-cost weapon. Lifesteal is fantastic. So really good card. Is it good enough to like push a rainbow DK forward? Is it good enough to support this rune allotment? I don't know if it's that good all in its own right, but definitely a card to keep an eye on, at least for when the runes do potentially match up for this one. Could be pretty interesting. Moving on to Death Knight and Paladin here, we have the Prosthetic Hand, which is a really cool card. This is a 3-mana 3/1 mech. It's got Magnetic and Reborn, and it can magnetize to either mechs or undead, which is pretty sweet. I love the flavor of this card a lot. So, you know, basically a buff style card here that's not only adding meaningful stats and aggression with that 3 attack. That's pretty meaningful if you want to start whacking face or taking trades up, but also a reborn aspect can benefit really nicely for anybody that needs to be re-summoned, which is good. Now, it is, of course, limited to these 2 different minion types, mechs or undead. So you have some pretty specific use cases, primarily mechs for Paladin and undead for Death Knight. Now, Mech Paladin, you know, was good for a very long time, but that has definitely not been the flavor of Paladin lately. The more aggressive Paladins right now are just kind of generally divine shieldy and buffy. And then you've also got Earthen Paladins, which certainly don't have mechs. The Earthens are not mechs. So doesn't really fit into the 2 most prominent builds of Paladin today, and I don't really see this bringing back Mech Paladin. Now, on the undead side of things for Death Knight, like Plague, DK, I mean, it does have some early game undead stuff that's possible, you know, like the Distressed Cavaldier has the death rattle that shuffles plagues in. Technically, the Prosthetic Hand could work there, but ultimately, I don't think that deck is like tokeny enough. It doesn't have enough like bodies floating around. I don't think there's enough upside on this Reborn either to make it worth it. So basically, the Prosthetic Hand here, it looks a little isolated in this current meta. It's definitely going to take a different look, I think, in future metas for the Prosthetic Hand to get there. Now, that said, I think this is still an efficient card and has that potential because, you know, number one, we know Magnetic can be really good. We know buffs like this can be good. And the Reborn aspect in particular gives this an interesting angle where as soon as you start stacking really good death rattles, resummon style effects like that, this becomes much, much better. So all in all, I do think the Prosthetic Hand is good, just not yet. So next up here, we have Mining Casualties, new 2-mana spell, Paladin and Death Knight. It's going to summon you 2 1/1 Silverhand Recruits with Death Rattle, summon a 1/1 Frail Ghoul, which is 4 bodies for 2 mana, which is pretty nice. The Frail Ghoul is just the Death Knight Hero Power token card. It does have charge, so if you trade in these Silverhand Recruits on your turn, you could use those Frail Ghouls to continue trading in, or maybe if there's nothing left to hit, you can also send them face. So all in all, just a big old pile of stuff. That's 4 corpses for Death Knight, which is really nice. Some Silverhand Recruit synergy for Paladin, which I don't think is really going to be as important. I doubt that matters much. We have some Silverhand Recruit stuff technically in Standard, but not enough to get that there. But I could see this being just a really good early board builder, body development, corpse builder for Death Knight. It definitely makes a lot of sense there. So that said, let's do some quick reviews. Elemental Companion is a 4-star card. Mantle Shaper is a 4-star card. Summoning Ward is a 1-star card. Shimmer Shot is a 4-star card. Obsidian Revenant is a 2-star card. Mismatched Fossils is a 2-star card. Quartzite Crusher is a 3-star card. Prosthetic Hand is a 3-star card. Mining Casualties is a 4-star card. And there you go. That wraps it up for this review. Man, I think there were some really clever designs in this one. I liked the flavor of these a lot, and the art's pretty insane too on some of these. I don't necessarily think all these are going to be good or super useful, but man, really home run flavor hits. So exciting stuff. That said, curious to hear your thoughts on these. Do you like some of these better than me? Do you think the Elemental Companions are going to be absolutely nuts and broken? I want to hear those thoughts and more down below. Thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.